Happening. Happy hump day to you and yours. Thanks for joining us. As always, it is very much appreciated. There is lots of smoke right now, as we've talked about the last few weeks, but there's one constant regarding the Patriots the last couple of weeks. They are pursuing a wide receiver one at the X position to help this offense. And the reason why I bring that up is because there are a lot of people reporting that the Patriots are continuing to look at receiver and that they are open to the idea of trading. They might actually be looking to trade to get something done. We're talking about national reporters and local reporters. Let's start with Adam Kaplan yesterday from the Pro Football Network. Here's what he posted. Patriots expected to have Troy Franklin from Oregon in for a pre-draft visit. As we reported last month, they were looking at the veteran trade market at wide receiver, and it's still a position to watch for them as we get closer to the draft. So Adam Kaplan says Patriots are looking at the veteran trade market at wide receiver. Tom Curran last Thursday night on BST, NBC Sports Boston, said, I do believe, my sense is, they'd be happy to make a trade to try and get better at those positions, including wide receiver, if they can't do it in the draft. Chad Graff last Friday posted this. While this is a deep wide receiver draft class, so many day two options thrive in the slot, and the Pats don't really need another slot receiver. Do they consider getting aggressive and moving up from 34 for an outside wide receiver or use 34 in a trade? Greg Bedard, my buddy at BSJ, here's what he wrote recently. I put the odds of a before draft trade happening at about 70%. I think a Pro Bowl level vet plus a receiver or two in the draft will be the way they ultimately go. Adam Kaplan, Tom Curran, Chad Graff, Greg Bedard, all pointing towards the Patriots trying to acquire a wide receiver one. Every single one of them saying, well, from what I've heard, from what I understand, all of this, I don't think, is one big fat coincidence. When you have the kind of reach that this has, when you talk about somebody like Adam Kaplan nationally, when you talk about the local guys and Tom Curran, Chad Graff, Greg Bedard, look, Tom Curran has been very, very keyed in on what this organization wants to do. You can go back since the mutual parting of the ways with Bill Belichick when Curran said, post-Colts game, they had made up their mind. Something dramatic would have had to happen for them to keep Belichick. When you look at far and near reporters saying that the Patriots are looking at acquiring a veteran wide receiver, I believe the Patriots are looking to acquire a veteran wide receiver. Because notice, there are no names, right? There are no names that are being floated. There are no names of teams. There are no names of football players. Nobody's specifically saying T. Higgins. Nobody is specifically saying Justin Jefferson or CeeDee Lamb, et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't think this is a case of somebody trying to build leverage. If this was one side trying to build leverage against the other side, you would have some inkling as to who we're talking about here. This just states that the Patriots, they want a wide receiver one. They are pursuing a wide receiver one. There's too much fire. There's way too much fire to believe. Well, let me scratch that. There's way too much smoke to believe that there's not fire here. Too many people saying the same thing. Too many people getting the vibe, getting word leaked to them. There's too much talk about the Patriots being in the veteran wide receiver trade market for it not to be true. Does that guarantee something? Of course it doesn't guarantee anything. That's not how this works. But I do believe with so many people saying the same thing at the same time, I do believe that the Patriots are trying to acquire a veteran wide receiver who can be that number one guy, especially if they don't feel like they can get that somebody in the draft. And what this tells me is, from the very beginning, Elliott Wolf understands the mission. He talked about weaponizing the offense, and a lot of people went bananas when they did not sign Calvin Ridley. I thought they were going to weaponize the offense. What happened to weaponizing the offense? And as I've said from day one, you can weaponize the offense in a myriad of ways. You can weaponize the offense via free agency. You can weaponize the offense via the draft. You can weaponize the offense via trading, whether that's before the draft, during the draft, or after the draft. There are many, many ways that you can weaponize this offense. And for the people that got disgusted at this idea of weaponizing the offense and saying, oh, they didn't do that in free agency, so they failed, I think they're being short-sighted. Because when you look at it from 30,000 feet, there are a number of different ways you can add to your offense. The Houston Texans just traded for Stephon Diggs, didn't they? That's weaponizing the offense. They didn't do it through free agency. They did it through trades. How about C.J. Stroud? Did that weaponize the Texans' offense? I think that weaponized the offense. Last time I checked, he was a draft pick. So there are different ways to do it. So the fact that Elliott Wolf almost from day one has said we want to weaponize the offense, he understands the mission. Calvin Ridley, the offer they put on the table for Calvin Ridley tells us that they want to add a legit number one receiver. Now, some might say Ridley's not a number one, but when you look at the free agency class and who was left after the tagging situation, he was the guy that was left on the market that you could say is at least close to being a number one receiver. And they offered him $40 million guaranteed, which was more than I anticipated them offering him, which tells you they are serious in trying to acquire somebody. They are not content with this wide receiver room. They're just not. They're not content with it. If they were content with it, we would not be hearing so much word about them wanting to acquire somebody, wanting to improve this offense. We wouldn't be hearing from Kaplan. We wouldn't be hearing from Bedard or Curran or Graff. We wouldn't be hearing this kind of stuff. All right, before I move forward, I want to remind you that the Nick Cattle Show is brought to you by Warzone Paintball and Airsoft. Warzone has 9 maps, 30-plus acres of land, multiple villages, hilltop forts, paintball, airsoft, kid versions of paintball and airsoft, something for every age group starting at 6+. Show up with jeans, good shoes, a long sleeve shirt. They'll take care of the rest. It's casual. It's low-key. 4.9 star rating for the staff, so they will absolutely take care of you. Warzone Paintball and Airsoft in North Kingston, Rhode Island. Give them a call at 401-228-6366. Want to take the kids, want to go out there with your friends and have a hell of a time, 401-228-6366. Tell them the Nick Cattle Show sent you. All right. So there are lots of options. There are lots of options to do something here. If you are Wolf, you're that front office, and you are serious about adding some kind of significance to that wide receiver room, there are plenty of options to do it. You can pull off a trade, right? Tomorrow, I'm so excited for this. Tomorrow officially makes it 2 weeks away from the draft. We are just over 2 weeks away from the night we've been waiting for since pretty much week 15 of the regular season, when we were all paying attention to what pick the Patriots would end up with. 2 weeks away tomorrow. Get excited. But you can make a move before the draft like Houston just did. You can make a move during the draft like other teams have, right? A.J. Brown, I believe, if I remember correctly, A.J. Brown, that trade was during the draft. You can move up. The Patriots can decide that they feel that that number one receiver is actually in this draft. Whether that's Brian Thomas Jr., A.D. Mitchell, those are really the two names that we look at because we all believe Marvin Harrison Jr., Rome Odunze, and Malik Neighbors will be off the board by the 10th or 11th pick. So if you're moving back into the first round for a wide receiver, the most likely names are the two I just gave you. You could probably land a Xavier Legette at 34 if you just decided to stick and pick. Ladd McConkey, kind of a tweener between late first round, early second round. But if you're looking for that bona fide X receiver, Brian Thomas Jr., A.D. Mitchell are the two guys in the first round that the Patriots, it would make sense for them to move back into that first round and draft one of those guys. One of those guys. It would make sense. So there's a lot of different things you can do. My favorite option is actually trading for a wide receiver one after the draft. And I know that's going to take patience. And I know we will see a bunch of people on Twitter and a bunch of people online losing their ever-loving minds about not getting a receiver on draft weekend, not getting that true number one guy. I think the smartest business for the Patriots, if they're going to acquire a veteran, is to wait until this draft is over, or wait until you get to the 4th round, 5th round, wait until day 3. Because if you pull off a trade using a future pick, you don't have to mess with the picks that you have right now. And we all agree, we all understand that the Patriots have multiple needs, and they need to fill holes in this roster with this draft. And you have primo selections in the first 4 rounds. And many will say that this draft is really 4 rounds deep. Once you get to the 5th round, the drop-off in talent because of COVID, all the upperclassmen, this is really a draft that you're focused on the top 150, top 120. The Patriots right now, as it stands, they have 4 picks close to the top 100, right? In that 4th round, they got pick 103. I want to use those 4 picks, whether it's moving up in the draft, adding a couple of picks. I want to utilize those picks in this draft to find young talent. So I actually think that it makes the most sense to wait until after the draft to trade a 2025 pick for that wide receiver, right? Before we move forward, got to give you that reminder. Give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to like the podcast if you love the content that we do. Don't forget to subscribe as well. Still short of our goal of 3,000, hopefully getting there by the end of the week. Rate and review on Spotify and Apple Pods. The Patriots have cap space. They have cap space to utilize. Some people are worried about the Patriots not having enough cap space after Kyle Duggar and Michael Wenu. That is not true. They still have more than enough cap space to take care of business. And that includes with helping Matthew Judon, maybe tacking on a couple of extra million, tacking on an extra year. That would also include Christian Barmore and a big fat contract extension for him. It's all about contractual structure, my friends. If you structure the contracts in the right way, you are not soaking up all of your cap space in this given offseason. So they still have enough cap room to make a move. With that in mind, what's the latest on T. Higgins? T. Higgins is a name that many of us have talked about. T. Higgins is a name that many of you have dreamed about. What's going on with T. Higgins? What is happening with him? We've got the latest. This is from Paul Denner Jr. of The Athletic, and here's what he wrote. Here's what he wrote about T. Higgins. Higgins' frustration with the franchise tag didn't shake the Bengals front office, which remains resolute on having Higgins return. Now, Denner compared Higgins' situation to Stephon Diggs, and he wrote, Diggs is 30 years old, Higgins at 25, far higher level of frustration bubbling for a Buffalo team, hitting reset with younger players as Josh Allen's money truly impacts the roster. The Bengals are not there yet. They're still in the process of going for it with Higgins and are enthused to do so. Denner writes in The Athletic that Cincinnati would need a substantial haul to deal Higgins. He continues, Brian Burns was traded on the franchise tag from the Panthers to the Giants for the 39th pick and a 2025 5th rounder. He was given a contract exceeding what Higgins should expect, $28 million AAV and $87.5 million guaranteed. It's hard to see Cincinnati receiving better compensation than that, writes Denner. That would suggest dreams of a first-round pick in compensation wouldn't fall close to the current market, thus shifting out of the Bengals' consideration. So Denner says the Bengals want a first-round pick for Higgins. If you look at the trade between the Panthers and the Giants for Brian Burns, there's no way on God's green earth that the Bengals are going to get a first-round pick for T. Higgins. I could have told you that months ago. I could have told you that a year ago and saved a lot of time. Denner writes that Cincinnati is very unlikely to move Higgins and a pick to move up. So they're not interested in moving T. Higgins and their pick to move up higher in the first round and maybe get a Malik Neighbors, for example, or some of the other names that I mentioned a little while ago. If seeking a slightly more realistic sweet spot, both the Cardinals, 27 and 35, and Patriots, 34, need receivers, have picks at the top of the second round, and have cap space. The option, if presented, would be enticing. So Paul Denner Jr. in The Athletic writes, the Bengals wanted a number one for Higgins. They know they're not going to get a first-round pick for him. They are enthused about keeping him. But if it's a top of the second-round pick, it would be enticing. This smells like leverage to me, doesn't it? I don't know if it smells like leverage to you, but this smells like we're trying to get a deal done. This comes across to me as Cincinnati is looking for the best deal. They would be enticed by a top of the second round pick, which tells me it's very unlikely that anybody has offered a top of the second round pick yet for T. Higgins. There's a reason why Paul Denner wrote that. Yes, in the best world, in the perfect world, Cincinnati would have T. Higgins on the team this year, and they would try to win a Super Bowl with Higgins along with Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow. But in reality, they know that Higgins is not happy. They know they're not going to be able to afford or don't want to pay both Chase and Higgins. Chase's contract extension is going to start to be negotiated here sooner rather than later. They understand the reality of the situation. So what this article in The Athletic tells me is that Cincinnati is open for business. They're open for business, and they're hoping for a top of the second round pick in return for Higgins, because there's no way that Chase and Higgins are going to be playing together in 2025. So here's my question to you. Would you trade? Again, we started this podcast talking about all of these reports, from Adam Kaplan to Tom Curran to Greg Bedard to Chad Graff, everybody reporting or hinting or, setting out the rumor that the Patriots, they will still be in business to acquire a veteran receiver. Everybody's kind of pointing towards it. So if you're the Patriots, would you be willing to give up pick number 34 and let's say a late pick swap for T. Higgins? Would you make that move? Would you trade number 34 in a late pick swap for T. Higgins? Would you pull the trigger on that? As you think about it, don't forget to give us a thumbs up, like the podcast, more likes, more eyeballs. Let's smash the YouTube algorithm. Don't forget to subscribe. Also, rate and review Spotify, Apple Pods. That always helps. And our Patreon members, by the way, $5 a month, exclusive content tonight. The exclusive Patreon podcast will look into Drake May's mechanics in a recent report that came out telling us whether or not May is a lost cause. We'll get into that tonight on the Patreon page. You can check it out. The description, you get all the info. $1.25 a week. Would you make that move? All right, before I give you my answer on whether or not I would trade 34 and have a late round pick swap for T. Higgins, I go to our super chat. New England Patriot Kid, $5 super chat. Thank you. If you want your comment or your question read, send us a super chat. That's how you jump to the front of the line. Would you rather get T. Higgins or DK Metcalf? DK Metcalf. And I would go with Metcalf because we've seen Metcalf be the true number one guy. Metcalf has been asked to be wide receiver one. He has produced as a wide receiver one. Now, he's not perfect, right? He lets his emotions get the best of him at times. We've seen that. But he is somebody who has legitimately produced as the number one guy on an offense. Higgins, he's had Chase. He's had Boyd. He's also had a much better quarterback in Joe Burrow than DK Metcalf has had in Seattle. Geno Smith, while better than what he used to be, is still not great. Far from it. Russell Wilson was aging, beginning the process of being washed. So I would take Metcalf. If it was between Higgins and Metcalf, I would take Metcalf. Another super chat, IV_213. If we do end up drafting someone as raw as Drake May, and we fail to acquire any major receiving upgrades this season, is he then a must-sit? It's a great question. It all depends on what Alex Van Pelt, Ben McAdoo, T.C. McCartney, it all depends on how they evaluate May. And I think it goes beyond wide receiver one. Whether you have wide receiver one or not, I think it really breaks down to the fundamentals. If Van Pelt and McCartney and McAdoo believe that Drake May needs reps to get better at some of the things that he's raw, then you play him, even without a wide receiver one. It's not a perfect situation, but if the QB gurus, so to speak, on this staff believe playing him puts him in a better position to succeed in the long term, then you play him. And you look at it as adversity. That's what I would say. Wide receiver one, to me, should not necessarily impact whether or not you play the guy right away. It's about whether or not that guy is ready. Wide receiver one can help you, but it's not the end-all, be-all. You can have a great wide receiver out there, but if your footwork stinks, your mechanics stink, if you're airmailing passes, if you're turning the football over, if you're getting skittish in the pocket, none of that stuff matters. And I would also say this, IV_213. The other thing I would contemplate is the offensive line. Do you feel like the offensive line is good enough to protect your young quarterback? If you're in minicamp, if you're in the preseason, you're training camp, and you're seeing your offensive line be leaky, I would not be rushing to throw out my young quarterback with that offensive line. So we have to see what they do with the offensive line as well. I appreciate the super chat. Great question so far. Again, if you want to jump to the front of the line, you can do that by sending those super chats. All right, would I trade number 34 in a late pick swap for T. Higgins? I'm a no on this. Now, I'm not a hard pass on it. I'm not a no way in hell, because inevitably T. Higgins would be by far the most productive receiver you have in that room and the most talented receiver in that room, and he's still only 25. But I am a no. If I get the phone call today, I'd say thanks, but no thanks on that deal for a number of different reasons. If I'm Elliott Wolf, I want the opportunity to react to the board. And what I mean by that is we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen on draft night. We can read all the mock drafts that we want. We can listen to all the pundits talk about it. We all believe that, 3 quarterbacks are going to go 1, 2, 3. A lot of people now telling us quarterbacks are going to go 1 through 4. None of us know that. None of us know a freaking thing. Mock drafts are fun. They're a fun little exercise. But the vast majority of them, if not all of them, end up being terribly wrong. So I want the opportunity. If I'm Elliott Wolf, I'm not trading 34 until I start to see what happens on draft night, because I have no clue. What happens if Brian Thomas Jr. starts to fall? What if I love Brian Thomas Jr. and he starts to fall to like the early to mid 20s, and I can trade up to draft Brian Thomas, and I think Brian Thomas is as good as T. Higgins, and I have to pay Brian Thomas almost nothing compared to Higgins, which means I can use that money elsewhere, not just this offseason, but in future off seasons. I don't know why you would take number 34 out of the equation before you know what's happening in this draft. Before you know where Brian Thomas falls. Before you know where A.D. Mitchell goes. What if the draft falls in your favor? I'm not telling you this is a likelihood. But what happens? What happens if you're sitting there at 34 and you start to realize, holy crap, A.D. Mitchell might fall to us to 34. And what if you're Elliott Wolf and you love A.D. Mitchell? And you say to yourself, we could get Mitchell at 34. We don't even have to trade an extra asset for that. We can just stick and pick and get the guy that we think is better than T. Higgins. So why would you make that move? To me, it doesn't make any sense to make a move like that before the draft. Unless you're completely out on all these receivers. If you are dead set at getting a receiver and you are absolutely against Brian Thomas, A.D. Mitchell, Xavier Legette, Ladd McConkey, Xavier Worthy. Now, not all those guys are fits because the Patriots at this point are looking for an X receiver. But if you're Elliott Wolf and you're totally out on these receivers, then maybe you would entertain it. But it's hard to believe that any GM in the league right now would be out on these receivers because that position is so deep. So why would you just not sit and wait and see where this draft goes? You might be surprised who could be available at 34. Maybe you can slide in to a late first round pick. In my mock draft, I traded up to Detroit. I think they're 29. What happens if you can trade up to 29, 20? I wouldn't say 28 because that's Buffalo. They might move up for a receiver. What happens if you can move into the mid-20s to late 20s and land your A.D. Mitchell and not necessarily have to give up 34 to do it? I mean, there's so many things that can happen. We have no clue what in the world is going to go down. What happens if only 4 quarterbacks get drafted and you're sitting there at 34 and you have Bo Nix and Michael Penix and you have a team that is desperate to move up and give you a bag and you only have to move back a couple of spots in the second round to do it? There's just so many different things. You also have to think about what are your options at 34. You can stick and pick at 34, right? You can trade up using 34. You can stick and pick and not pick a receiver. You can pick a left tackle. What happens if Kingsley Suamataia is sitting there at 34? What happens if Jordan Morgan is sitting there at 34? What happens if Amarius Mims slides down the board more than people think, and you can trade into the first round and draft your left tackle of the future? If you trade 34 right now for T. Higgins, you're giving up those options. You're giving up all of those options you may have on draft night. You give up the option of just sticking and picking an X receiver. All right, don't forget to give us that thumbs up. Let's beat the algorithm. Like, subscribe, Spotify, Apple Pods, rate and review. You can also check out the Patreon page in the description. $5 a month, exclusive bonus content for you over at the Patreon. Jannard Walker jumps in with a super chat. Would you rather have Devontae Smith or T. Higgins? Interesting name in Devontae Smith. Interesting name. Because part of this conversation, Jannard, and why I would not pull the trigger on a T. Higgins for 34 in a late round pick swap right now if I were Elliott Wolf, part of that conversation is cost analysis. What do you have to give up to get a receiver? What if you could get another receiver that is an X, that is a wide receiver 1, but for less than you would have to pay for a Higgins? I'll give you a name. It's a name a lot of us have talked about. How about Amari Cooper? Now, I know the Browns have come out and said, oh, we want to keep Amari, blah, 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 blah. They have cap issues. They have some cap issues. Cooper's on the last year of his deal. They've brought in a couple of receivers. They traded for Jerry Jeudy and gave him the bag. What if you could get Amari Cooper for a 5th-round pick or a late-round pick swap? What if you could get Amari Cooper in a 6th round for your 5th round? You're paying a heck of a lot less than you would pay for T. Higgins, but you get a guy who's been in the AVP offense. You have a guy who was productive last year. He's not too long in the tooth right now. He's on a 1-year deal. Maybe you can cook that into a 2-year deal for a little bit less money. What if you can get Amari Cooper for a late-round pick swap? Is that better than bringing in T. Higgins and paying T. Higgins all the money and giving up 34? I think it is. What if you have better options than Higgins for a 2nd-round pick? And this is where Jannard's super chat comes into play. He mentions Devontae Smith. What happens if Philly wants to keep Devontae Smith? What happens if A.J. Brown is available? A.J. Brown has been in the middle of some drama. Called the Philadelphia radio station to try to slow down the narratives out there. But what if Brown is truly unhappy? What if there is something wrong between he and Hurts? And Jannard Walker brings up this idea of Devontae Smith's contract. Smith is in the same spot as a Jamar Chase. Those teams have to figure out how much are we going to pay this guy. So if Philadelphia wants to keep Devontae Smith, are they willing to keep Smith and Brown? Same thing in Miami. Is Miami willing to keep Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle? I don't think any of those teams are going to be willing to do that because of the depth of the receiver class that we see year in and year out, including this season. It would be an embarrassment of riches to pay not 1 but 2 receivers at the top of the market when you can draft a wide receiver 2 and keep the younger wide receiver 1 that you want. So a lot of these names, what if you could get, I don't think Miami would trade you Waddle because obviously inside the division, but what if you could get one of the Philadelphia receivers? Would that be better than T. Higgins? What if you could get Brandon Ayuk in San Francisco? What if some of these other guys are out there and you don't know until draft night, which is another reason why I wouldn't pull the trigger on a deal right now, especially, and thanks for the super chat, Jannard, appreciate it. That's one of the major reasons why I wouldn't pull a deal right now, because I want to make those other teams uncomfortable. I want to make Cincinnati feel uncomfortable. I want them sitting there in their war room on draft night going, what the hell are we going to do with T. Higgins? What are we going to do? We can't keep this guy. We can't go into camp with T. Higgins. If we go into camp with Higgins, he's going to make a lot of noise. He wants a new deal. He's going to be a distraction. What are we going to do? We've got to move on. We've got to move on and make a deal. I want them to feel that pressure. I want them on the hot seat. I don't want them to feel the comfort of 2 weeks out from the draft and saying, just going to sit back and I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait this thing out. I want to put pressure on the Patriots or another team looking to add this guy. I want Philadelphia to feel the heat. I want San Francisco to feel the heat with Brandon Ayuk. I want those teams to be uncomfortable. I want those teams almost feeling borderline desperate to pull off a deal because now I have leverage. And the closer you get to draft night, the more you have that leverage. And some people might say, Nick, the Patriots are desperate. Not if Elliott Wolf sells to those teams. Hey, look, we know this is a 2 or 3 year process. We're not worried about adding a number one guy right now this second. This is going to take some time. We're not going to make a deal just to make a deal. So as you get closer to draft night, as you get into draft night, these teams start to figure out, man, we got to pull the trigger on something. And I want them feeling uncomfortable. I want to see how the draft plays out in front of me and how truly valuable 34 can be. We think 34 is valuable right now. 34 could be incredibly valuable on draft night. 34 could end up being much more valuable than we think right now because of how the board falls on April 25th. So if I'm Elliott Wolf, I'm keeping that pick until draft night. I want more bang for the buck, baby. And I want to put the pressure on everybody else. You come calling to me. Come calling to me. Because I'm not doing anything like I have to do anything. I am not desperate. This is a 2 to 3 year rebuild. I'll take my time. That's what I would be selling to those other teams. And let's think about Elliott Wolf for a minute. Let's think about Wolf. Let's think about that Green Bay front office. The Green Bay front office hit on a number of receivers. And they did not necessarily believe that you had to spend a first-round pick on a receiver to hit on a receiver. Matter of fact, you'd have to go back to like Javon Walker to see a guy that was in the first round that they took. You look at the second round, that's where Green Bay did damage. Historically, Elliott Wolf, Ron Wolf, and that Green Bay front office, they attacked the receiver in the second round. That doesn't necessarily mean they won't attack it in the first round this year if they move back into it. But it does, I think, give us an idea of how Wolf likely envisions what that position is and how much you should invest and how you can find guys. We've talked about this. You go back several weeks ago, it might be like 2 months ago now at this point. We did a podcast on this channel and I broke down wide receiver. And I broke down all the receivers that have been drafted in the second round and later that have ended up being number one guys. And you can literally go through every draft and find one or two guys, at least one or two guys that have been drafted in the second round or later and had an immediate impact on their football team and were number one guys. I mean, you can look at the league is littered with them. The latest example is Puka Nacua out in LA, 5th round pick, number one guy. You can look at someone like, St. Brown in Detroit, Amon-Ra St. Brown. He wasn't a first round pick. A.J. Brown wasn't a first round pick. There's just so many guys, right? And so the Packers, if you look at Wolf's history, They hit in the second round. Devontae Adams, nailed it. Randall Cobb, nailed it. And many, many others I don't have to name. Shoot, you look at what Green Bay has right now. They don't have that stud first-round pick at wide receiver. What they did was they invested in a bunch of young receivers in the early to mid rounds. Watson and Dobbs and Wicks and those guys. That's what they did. That's what they did. Every single year, and this is before this super deep class, pretty much every single year you can look at the history of the draft and you can find guys that were drafted second, third, fourth, fifth round. So Elliott Wolf might feel like I can get somebody as good as T. Higgins or some of these other guys. I can find that receiver at 34 if I just stick and pick. It's going to be a fascinating time, but a lot of people, reporters, Adam Kaplan, Tom Curran, Greg Bedard, Chad Graff, others, a lot of reporters talking about the Patriots looking for that wide receiver one. They want a wide receiver one. Will it happen pre-draft? Will it happen during the draft? Will it happen after the draft? Will it even happen? We don't know. But it certainly sounds like the front office, Elliott Wolf, they have receiver in their crosshairs, which I think is good news because that room absolutely needs an upgrade. The Patriots absolutely need a wide receiver one. Absolutely. That's not even debatable. Don't forget to give us that thumbs up, like the podcast if you like, or even love the content. If you love the content, hopefully you've already given us that thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, trying to hit 3,000 subscriptions this week. We're about 30, 40 away. Help us do that by subscribing. You get notified when we go live. Rate and review on Spotify and Apple Pods. And Patreon. You get the Patreon page, and that, of course, is $5 a month. Exclusive content. Tonight, we're going to do a podcast for Patreon members about Drake May and his mechanics. A very interesting story / report came out yesterday about May and his mechanics and whether or not he's a lost cause. We're going to do a very special exclusive podcast on that Patreon page tonight about May's mechanics. Slide a little Bruins in there as well. Playoff rotation at goalie. How do we feel about it? So check out the Patreon page. And always appreciate the super chats. We're done for today. Something breaks. We will be back, of course, to break it and talk about it. If not, we're back tomorrow at 11 a.m. sharp right here on YouTube. Thank you for hanging out with me for a little while. It is much, much appreciated. This has been the Nick Cattle Show.